Welcome everyone. We're just waiting for one or two more people to join in. Okay, Dave, over to you. I think we can get started.
Okay. Well, welcome to all of you that are here for this ACM workshop. The title, The Biblical Worldview, the Importance of the Family in the Culture War. And I'm really looking forward to this. Nicola, so good to have you with us today. And as I'm now a grandparent and I watch my grandchildren, I just try and grapple with their worldviews and the reality of Minecraft and the irrelevance of most other things. Somehow we need this way of interpreting the modern world. Nicola Jager is an associate professor of politics at Stellenbosch University, and she looks at how we can establish ourselves in the truth. This presentation will aim to provide an in-depth understanding of the times in which we find ourselves, to uncover the ideological roots of critical theory and its offshoot of radical gender theory, and their intended consequences for identity, children, family, and society. Just a little bit about Nicola. She is married. She's survived 2 teenage sons. I think you wouldn't be looking so young if you had daughters in that mix, but well done. She holds a PhD in political science and associate professor at Stellenbosch University. I'm not going to go through all the details there. Just she committed her life to the Lord in 1997. Over the years, she has presented in her personal capacity on worldviews, understanding the times, and governance at various biblical worldview workshops. She's currently presenting Worldview's teaching across South Africa as part of the Wilberforce Academy South Africa. The desire of hers is to see the restoration of sphere-based authority, self-governance, family governance, church governance, and state governance. And I like this last bit here. To help her to be a nicer person, she regularly trail runs with her friends and dog. So it's so important to get out there, and a dog at least doesn't criticize anything. So that's great. Let's just pray before we start. Father, I just thank you that we can learn, and we thank you for Nicola and for the insights that you'll be giving us today. And Lord, I just pray that you'll help us to learn what you have for us and to be able to apply it in our ministries and in our media work. In Jesus' name, amen. Over to you, Nicola. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Natalie. Thanks, ACM, for having me. Hi, Graham. I believe it's through you that I'm here. Nice to see you. I see there's a whole team there in the GNCR room. So hi, everybody there. So thanks very much for having me. Yes, there's nothing quite like a dog. They love you irrespective, and even if you've been out for 5 minutes, they are still so pleased to see you. It's like you were gone for a whole week. There's nothing quite as good for the ego as a loving dog, and they are so appreciative So just that run is just the best thing ever. So it's good to be here. I do want to quickly say that I am obviously here in my personal capacity. I come, yes, with an academic background, which I hope helps me to try and understand the world and the times we live in, and hopefully to help other people unpack it and understand the times in which they find themselves in. But yeah, so the academic world helps me to interpret, hopefully, but it's obviously the love of the Lord that, and to see his kingdom come, that I do this. Okay, so let me just quickly share the screen. All sorts of screens.
Sorry, while that is coming up, just if you've got questions as we go along, please put them in the chat box, and then we can work from there. Thanks.
Okay, super. Dave, can you confirm? Can you see the screen? Is everything okay there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see the one slide and the next slide. I don't know whether you want that presentation or just the full.
It should just be the full slide. Okay, sorry everyone.
Yeah, because it's got a kind of working display here, not a.
It's not a
view. And I think if you're able to take off presenter view, it'll just be the one slide.
I must take off presenter view.
Yeah, not within Zoom, but within PowerPoint. I'm not too sure exactly which button it is, but there should be one that will say presenter view, and then you can just take that off. It should then just give you one slide.
Hello, Nicola. When you share your screen, there are multiple windows to share. Share the one that is the slideshow, not the one that is the presentation. So if you stop sharing and share again, but select the different view, the one that is the slide show.
Okay, so we go back to share, and then I need to go to.
You must look for another window that's called something like presentation or slideshow or something like that, not the presenter view.
There?
That's it. Perfect. Thank you.
Super. All these things that we learn. Goodness. These new technologies. Thanks so much for that. Okay, so firstly, how did I get into this? I'm as Dave said, I'm in political science. And so how did I get into the whole culture war and the family and so forth? Is I've always really been interested in worldviews, bigger picture, what's happening, and I do that in my studies. I started teaching last year for the first time regimes, and in particular comparing democratic regimes with authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. So it's been, I think what's happening just on the world sphere, which is for me interesting, is there's been a definite move away even from something like the acceptability of democracy and a willingness to consider other regime types, which I think in terms of human flourishing and for human freedom and for freedom of religion would be deeply problematic. But more specifically and closer to home, how did I get to this was obviously I'm a mom. So there's nothing like stirring up the mama bear to get her going. As a mom, I started to work with colleagues from Cultur Justice, and we started to have a look at the comprehensive sexuality education curriculum, the CSE. And I trust and hope that you have been looking at it and have looked at it. When we look at one of the scripted plans, bless you, whoever that was. We have been looking at the scripted plans. And I became very concerned in terms of what was intended to be taught to our children. Fortunately, civil society organizations had pushed back and said that these could not be compulsory. But also as a political scientist, I saw this as an intrusion of the public sphere, of the state sphere, into something which is personal. And that's using the school system to start teaching basically an ideology. So using the school system to teach a gender ideology into kids, and especially around issues of morality, which many would not agree with, and also in pushing into an area of authority as a parent, which is not which is my authority, or mine and my husband's authority. It's not their role to teach our kids around especially sexual issues. So that's kind of how I personally got involved and became more and more aware of this topic and became more involved inside of the topic. Okay, so I just want to first show you my family, and just to show you that family is really important to me. We do family, we do it a lot. And so this is obviously my husband and my two boys, who I am incredibly proud of. And yes, Dave, I don't know. I think the waters with girls, maybe it was just the grace of God, but I'm sure that there's a next level of mama bear that comes in, and papa bear, I can imagine, when it comes to girls, and starting wanting to protect them, especially in this current time. But so I've got two teenage boys, and I must say I love the teenage stage. It's actually incredibly rewarding. They're lots of fun, and you get to rag them, and you get to do fun things with them. And I'm very proud of my boys, and I enjoy them. So here is my brother and his family. There's the grandparents. We do dual living, so we really kind of embrace family. Everyone lives close by, and this is very precious to me. And this institution, this God-ordained, God-given institution, is really under enormous attack. It's also under enormous pressure. And one looks at this and you go, well, why? Why would this be so dangerous? What is it about this institution that is supposedly so problematic? And actually, it's interesting when you read some of the gender scholars, they actually say it's because it brings stability. And when you want to disrupt a system, you don't want stability. And the other thing is it brings a social network. So, I mean, the Bible gives us instruction that we are actually supposed to look after our family first and foremost. That's our first port of call. So that in that way, it creates independence, and it also creates independence from institutions like the state, where you're not dependent on the state because there's a family unit you protect and you look after each other. And then I think the other side is parents. And I think this is obviously also something I'll speak to, that is that we as parents are a social network, but we're not just, we're a net, rather, a protective net over our children. And I think more and more we're starting to see attempts to access our children and not positively, attempts to sexualize our kids, attempts to eventually literally remove that parental care and that parental protection, and to have, and I'm sorry to be so insidious, but really to have access to our children. So that's why we need to really guard this God-given institution. So I want to start with a scripture, which is very dear to me. It's one of the words that the Lord gave to me when I started my academic journey, and was really feeling quite overwhelmed by the environment which I found myself in. And this was the word he gave to me, so I don't know, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So I'd like to read it for us. Colossians 2, verses 2-8. In order that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I tell you this so that no one may deceive you by fine-sounding arguments. So then, just as you received Christ Jesus as Lord, continue to live your lives in him, rooted and built up in him, strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental forces of this world rather than on Christ. So Paul's letters, I think, are particularly important today, because it speaks to the environment very much so in which we find ourselves at the moment. So he was speaking to the church, the Colossians in Colossae, apparently that's in modern day Turkey, and he was addressing heresy and false teaching in the church. So I think it's important that we kind of look back, what do we mean by heresy? So heresy is to choose for oneself, and a heretic is one who places their choice and opinion above the authority of God. So what was happening in this church in the Colossians, there was a syncretism of Greek philosophy, Jewish legalism, and mysticism. And the three were coming together and presenting themselves as Christianity. So it's an early form of Gnosticism, so where salvation is through knowledge and not through faith, where Jesus was merely one of the semi-divine beings. So what Paul does is he alerts the believers to this, and he warns them of the dangers of returning to pagan vices, and obviously these vain philosophies and deceptive philosophies and the human traditions. And then he says to actually be established in the truth. So for me, there were two things that I take out of this, and they were very dear to me. The one was that we don't have to navigate this world feeling without confidence. We get to navigate this world with the confidence of Christ, in whom are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge. It's already there. In him is all the treasures and wisdom of knowledge. And that's part of also the Gnosticism, is that there's always apparently new knowledge. But, he's the Ancient of Days. He was the beginning, he is today, and he is the future, and he is the end. And in him is already all the wisdom and knowledge. So the one is to be established in Christ, to have our lives in him. And then the second thing is it says twice, do not be deceived. Do not be deceived. And do not be deceived by deceptive philosophy. And so I think this is where we find ourselves with the potential to be deceived by deceptive philosophy. So I'm going to use terms which some of you may use. And I ask that you obviously take it prayerfully and hear me out. So Paul, one of the things that's important is Paul did not encourage them to ingratiate themselves into the culture. So we sit in a time where we have to be careful that are we living our lives through the lens of the word, or are we trying to interpret the word through the lens of the world? And we are, yes, we're supposed to love, but not ingratiate ourselves into this current culture. Okay, so very broad strokes. What I want to do is I'm going to get to the family, but to understand what is happening in the attack of the family is that we have to understand where we find ourselves, just in terms of the current environment. So understanding the times we live in, very broadly, I would say that obviously there are periods before this. This is kind of like the zeitgeist, the environment, the broad environment. Obviously there's complexity in this that I'm not getting into. But I've divided the more recent history into three broader periods, the one being the 16th century with the Reformation really significantly changing the world and the environment, and ushering in a Christian Judaic era. So the Reformation starts with Martin Luther with his 95 Theses in 1517, where he says, no, we are saved by faith in Jesus Christ. There is no other God, and we are not God. And the religious leader is also not God. So we have access to God through Jesus. And then there's the supernatural. So there's the natural and the supernatural, God as creator and designer of the natural. So obviously that the European world then moved into 30 years of war between the Protestants and the Catholics. And that actually it ushered in eventually religious freedom between the two. They exhausted themselves and said, okay, fine, let's agree to disagree. And then we started to see religious freedom. And out of that started to spur other freedoms and increasingly other freedoms. And also into a time of great flourishing, especially in the European world. So I want to show you this. There's this idea that is really prevalent, maybe more so in America, but this idea that is portrayed also by this current environment that it's just the worst time in the world for women. It's the worst time in the world for African Americans, and yet globally we have never been in a more prosperous, flourishing time ever. So just let's see if this. I'm trying a new trick, and I'm going to see if this is going to work. Oh, and it does. Okay, perhaps not the best of views. But this I thought was really interesting. This is life expectancy, and this was 1770. So obviously it's perhaps one of the earliest measures that they have. In 1770, your average life expectancy was 29 years. So most of us would be long gone, very long gone. 29 years. Okay, that lasted all the way into the 1860, 1880, and then 1920, and then it started to change, tried to shift. And then even Africa lags a little bit, but 58 years where we're at 2012 is significantly more than 29. And now we see Europe at approximately 80 and the global average at 70 from 29. So we are in a time of actually, in this case, what we would say is human flourishing. Did that work?
Sorry, Nicola, yeah. We're not seeing. I think there's another slide you've got there that we're not seeing.
Okay. So it didn't work
on
the other one. Okay,
yes.
I'm not going to try and fiddle around because I'm nervous. So all I can tell you is that if you actually Google it, our world in data, and look at life expectancy, that it moved from 29 years to, in 1770 to 2012, which is now 70 years. So I'm going to close that. Okay, we're back to that. So there's actually a whole body of research around this, which shows the influence of the Protestant Reformation, also influencing into the Catholic Church, and this idea in particular of the value, inherent value. And this is a concept I'm going to come back to later, or I'm going to touch on as we go through the inherent value of every person, irrespective of their sex, their gender, their ethnicity, or their economic status. That there's an inherent value in every person as image bearers of God. And that inherent value also comes through having direct access to the divine through Jesus. So we don't have to go through a human person or an intermediary to have access to the ultimate divine. Every person has access to God through Jesus. And he's a personal God. And that brings in inherent human value, that every person is inherently valuable. And I just really want to say, again, irrespective of any of our social indicators, and not because of our social indicators. Okay, so then we move into the Enlightenment period. So the 17th century, really kind of ushering in the secular humanist era, and sometimes we speak about the secular humanists, but I think we're kind of outside of that now. We've moved outside of the secular humanists. There are still secular humanists there, and so here is a time and a period of science, rationalism, logic, that truth can be known, nothing that we would disagree with as Christians, except that it's moved to the place of this understanding and knowing and rationality and study and science. But then it's like, okay, thanks God, thanks for that. We don't need you anymore. We're going to put ourselves on the throne. So it's a move from while you recognize the natural, you don't recognize the supernatural anymore. And it's the placement of self onto the throne and the removal of God from the throne. So there's a secular theory, and it has not borne out. The secular theory is that as societies advance, they would evolve out of religion. So I have been in these academic environments where I show this one slide, which shows where Christianity is increasing in Africa and Latin America and Asia, and then it's declining significantly in Europe. And for many of my secular humanist colleagues, they will look at that and they will go, yeah, well, that's really good for Europe. We're not sure about Africa. And I interpret it completely different. Whereas I look at that and I go, oh, wow, it's Africa's turn. It's that the move. So they see it as advancing when you advance out of religion. So for them, you are kind of like, you kind of treat it with a little bit of disdain. You know, it's okay. You'll get there. You'll eventually, you know, educate yourself out of this understanding of religion, and we've got there. You know, so we understand our religious roots, but we've evolved out of our religious roots. So there's the thing with the secular humanist environment is that it's still very much so bound into Christian foundations in terms of rationalism and science and reality and the natural and order and structure. And so there's been a period of like an agreeing to disagree. And I think that was the environment which we found ourselves. There might have been some acerbic engagement with us, but there was a willingness to agree to disagree. We're now in a very different era. I would say in the 20th century, we've moved into the postmodern era. So kind of starting with the 1960s, bringing in broad skepticism, subjectivism, relativism, a general suspicion of reason, rationality, and a return to mysticism and paganism. So I would argue that if people sometimes say, I hear that argument like, no, you should get with the times, you know, times are moving. I said, no, the times that you're talking about is the Greek, Roman, pagan era. It's not moving forward, it's moving backwards. This is not a forward move. We've done this one before, we've seen this before. At its core is a rejection of the Christian God as it embraces polytheism. So it's that return to the Greek and Roman religions, traditional religions, multiple religions, and as I said, ushering in the pagan era, a polytheistic or pantheistic nature-worshipping religion where the adherents venerate nature, worship many deities, goddesses and gods, and really a more feminine face of the divinity. And as we're going to go in and I speak about the postmodernism, and it's important, you'll see where I'm getting to with how does this affect the family, is that actually we're finding ourselves, and I'm sure those of you who are, I know you're all in media, will find that you are more and more in a very hostile environment. That where the secular humanist environment, there was that disdain, but a willingness to, okay, you can have your voice. But in the postmodernism, there's an active shutting down of voice and of engagement and of difference, and I think of Christianity in particular. So it's a hostile environment in which we find ourselves, and where before you could have engagement and debate and discussion, because it's postmodern, because it doesn't believe in rationality and debate and engagement. And as I'll show, it's become reified, so their ideas have become established as truth. And they see themselves as almost, it has become, when you said the gender theology, it has become like a religion, which we are all expected to follow. So there is also no religious freedom. So you'll find when you engage in there, that will be shouted down, you will be labeled. So you get terms that are used against you. There just isn't that space for engagement anymore. Okay, so these are terms, the current terms that you probably have come across, and these are the terms in the environments in which we find ourselves: anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, critical race theory, critical theory, woke. So some of them may be terms that you use, and I want to encourage you to actually find out what they mean and the definitions, and ask people what they mean when they use them. So to be woke, this is the time where we are, as young people like to be woke, is to be aware and to be alert to the supposed layers of oppression in society, particularly surrounding race, sex, and economic status. So I hope you saw those terms again, where we have value in Christ, irrespective of those social indicators. Now there's layers that are determined by those indicators of race, sex, and economic status. This may feel like a fairly recent development, but this movement has a long history. And what we are seeing today is really a reformulation and a repackaging, making it more palatable with some of the terms, social justice, and more difficult to question. So the woke movement presents itself as a movement for justice and for the weak, and thus it can be very deceptive, especially for us as Christians, because it comes very close to the Christian worldview, where we are supposed to have great concern for the poor and for the orphan and for the widow. That is our call as a church. So it comes very close to that. But let me unpack it a little bit more. But it ostensibly actually weakens the people that it claims to help. And so we'll have a look at why do I say that. So the ideological roots, we're going to go back into a little bit of philosophy, and political philosophy and history. And I'm going to deal with these three men at the top. And obviously there's many more, and I'm finding that, oh my goodness, as I pull a thread, something else comes up and there's another thread, and there's much still to be unraveled. But this is where I am at in terms of my own unraveling. So it's important for us to delve into the history, because we need to understand the intentions and we need to understand the motivations of the drafters of these philosophies. So the key words that I'll highlight, and you might start going, oh yes, I've heard that, I've heard that. So let's start with the first one, Hegel on the left, 18th, 19th century German philosopher who developed what's called a dialectical scheme. Basically, he said that society was progressing and that history was a progress of ideas. So the words are synthesis, antithesis, thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. But basically what he was saying is that society was progressing towards a utopia, and that we needed a revolution to arrive there. So this heaven on earth, it can be attained here and now, but to get there, a revolution. So there's that key word, revolution was needed. Then we see Karl Marx in the middle. He was quite taken with Hegel's ideas, but he was a materialist. Everything was what he could see. So he said the society was divided into binaries. He called these the oppressed and the oppressor, and the rich oppressed the poor, and that utopia, in terms of Hegel's ideas, could be attained through the revolution of the poor against the rich, the oppressed against the oppressor. But you needed a dictatorship of the proletariat, the poor, or the working class, to create this eventual utopia, which was a classless equal society. But besides the bourgeoisie, he also said it was faith and family which stood in the way of utopia. So they said the faith and family underpinned the capitalist system. So obviously their whole thing was to remove the capitalist system, remove any form of property ownership. And one of the key issues he had, especially with family, was that inheritance would be passed down to children. So I'm going to quickly go ahead to this slide and come back. So just to show you some of the Marxist ideology, this was from the Soviet states, and this was a schooling theorist. And I'm going to read it. We must make the young into a generation of communists. Children, like soft wax, are very malleable, and they should be molded into good communists. We must rescue children from the harmful influence of the family. We must nationalize them from the earliest days of their little lives. They must find themselves under the beneficent, the all good, the all benign influence of the communist schools. To oblige the mother to give her child to the Soviet state, that is our task. Okay, I do think it echoes into what we're seeing today. Okay, so let's go back. So we've done Hegel with the revolution. We've got Marx, oppressed versus the oppressor, these binaries. One of the big issues for the Marxists and the communists was at World War I. After World War I, they had expected that the working class in Europe would rise up against your gentry, your bourgeoisie, your rich, and use the war as an opportunity to revolt, as it had happened with the Russian Revolution. What they found is that they didn't, and they tried to understand this. Why did they unite as nations? Why did they come together irrespective of their social status and not use that as an opportunity to revolt? And so this spurs into what we see now in terms of the critical theory. So in doing this, they argued that the problem was, or they saw the problem as, was culture. And this is the culture war. So they said that, okay, so it wasn't the economic, it was the culture, and the culture in which the working class found themselves in, and that they were actually controlled by this culture. So you had to disrupt, destroy, tear apart this culture so that they could be freed to see that they were really being oppressed. And so this moves into the culture wars, and some of the institutions of this culture would be family. The other institutions in particular would be civil society, the church, and so forth. So then we get this Antonio Gramsci. He's on the right, Italian communist, 1891 to 1937. And he viewed churches, charities, the media, schools as organizations that needed to be invaded by socialist thinkers. He's credited with writing the blueprint for the long march, and you might have heard the term, the long march through the institutions. But he didn't actually coin the term, he might have had the blueprint for it, but it was a student activist, Rudi Deutsch, around 1967, who actually coined this term of the long march through the institutions. So Gramsci wrote in the 1930s that we needed a war of position. So what he was meaning there, instead of full frontal warfare, he was saying you need trench warfare. So you need to go underground. So he said for the socialists and communists to subvert this culture, they would need to do it from the inside in an attempt to compel it to redefine itself. So the war of movement would be kind of like your full frontal warfare, but the war of position is that trench warfare. He defined civil society as the ensemble of organisms commonly known as private. So one of the distinctions that often is under attack, and this is what I refer to with the comprehensive sexuality education, is the private, which is the family. So you now hear also with your radical feminists who say that the private is public. And it's that kind of blurring of those lines again, where the public intrudes into the private, the public intrudes into the family, and not just intrudes, but actually starts to dictate to and tries to usurp the authority of for example, parents. And you can start to see this through this so-called long march through the institutions. So we move into that second line, and I'm going to start on the right-hand side with the Frankfurt School. So the Frankfurt School was initially the Institute for Social Research at the University of Frankfurt, established after World War I and the Russian Revolution. So they are particularly known for their culturally focused neo-Marxist theory. So theirs is looking at the culture. How do we change the culture? How do we disrupt the current culture? And it was here that the term critical theory was coined in 1937. Okay, so sometimes you'll hear the term cultural Marxism, and I know that your Marxists and your left are saying that it's a pejorative term used by your conservative thinkers, and they don't like it. But one can understand why, where the shift from your traditional Marxism, which was this economic the rich versus the poor, and the division of oppression in terms of that, to move towards engaging with the cultural institutions, the family, the church, the charities, civil society. So the term actually is quite descriptive, but we should be careful of using it because they've kind of taken it away from us as a term. But I'm just putting it out there that I do think it is a good descriptive term. Okay, so then we move on to the left-hand side, the postmodernism. So postmodernism, as I said, this is, I think, the time and the period in which we find ourselves in. It has given rise to one of the least tolerant, the most authoritarian periods in which we find ourselves since the decline of communism itself. So there are three phases of postmodernism. Phase one, 1960s, we see the rise of postmodernism, 1960s to 1990s. It's a response to modernism and the excesses of modernism. So it's deconstructivist, it's skeptical. It's in literature, this amounted to a reaction against an ordered view of the world. Postmodernists reject that there's an objective natural reality. They reject reason and knowledge. They say there's no such thing as human nature, but everything, rather human psychology, has been socially engineered. So this is that term of social constructivism. Everything is a social construct. So gender is a social construct, and now it's even moving into sex. So biological sex is a social construct. No objective reality, and all is relative. Rather, knowledge is a construct of power, and society is made up of power constructs that need to be deconstructed. So phase 2, 1990s, we start to see the applied or activist postmodernism. And this fragments, especially in the academia, so this is largely happening inside the academia. It fragments into fields of study called queer theory, critical race theory, fat studies, feminist studies, grievance studies, and gender theory, amongst others. And it's this whole postmodernist reconstructivism. So it's applied to specific academic fields and academic circles. So it kind of stays there. And many said, no, well, look, it's fine. It's just really in the liberal arts or in the social sciences. And it's not really going to go into the STEM, so the science and into the mathematics and so forth. That was until 2010. So now we are in phase 3 of postmodernism. And James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, and these are secular humanists. So what is interesting is we actually find ourselves sitting with the secular humanists, because the secular humanists are just as under attack as we are in this postmodern environment, because they don't believe in science or empirical research or in truth, or that truth can be found. So what happened is that there's been this reification of the ideas of postmodernists, and reification means it's made into a real thing. It is. So its principles are regarded now as known knowns. So these are assumptions. They move from assumptions which they don't question anymore. So in other words, society is structured of specifically identity-based systems of power and privilege that construct knowledge. There is systemic or institutionalized racism. There is systemic or institutionalized sexism. It is an abusive patriarchy. So this is their point of departure. So whenever they analyze any kind of situation, it's from that point of departure. So they're not asking, is it, and what are we seeing? They're saying it is, and then they will look for those things inside of it. And if need be, and we're seeing this happening in some of the schools, invent it. So as to eventually bring in things like diversity consultants and so forth. Okay, so you've got your postmodernism, you've got your Frankfurt School, your Marxism, and these are feeding into what I've referred to as the critical theory, which came from your Frankfurt School. And this woke culture that we find, especially that's very in vogue for our young people. And perhaps this term is the one that might be a little more difficult for us as Christians, is social justice. So the outcome of this move is supposedly towards social justice. And I'm going to engage with that term and argue why I don't think it's a Christian term. Okay, so these are ways. What is critical theory? What is this woke idea? And what is social justice? It is a way of seeing the world. And as I said, with this postmodernism, it's become rarefied. So it's steadily becoming the air that we breathe. We're not allowed to question it. It's that it is. And we live in an environment where we're expected to accept it. So critical theory, we can understand in terms of its 2 primary claims. Everyone can be divided into 2 groups, those who have power and those who don't. Those who have power always oppress those who don't. And humanity is divided into 2 fundamental categories: the oppressor, those with power, and the oppressed, those without power. Can you see the Marxist terms that have come through and the binaries that have come through? But how do we know who is the oppressed and who the oppressors are? The critical theorists will tell us. According to the critical theorists, the categories of the oppressed and the oppressor are based on your group identity. And I want you to see that now, not irrespective of, but because of. So what has become important is your race, your class, your sex, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your physical ability, your age, your weight, and many other classifications. Not only are you, it's not just your sexual preference, it is who you are. So these have become identities. It's your definition, is who you are identified as. And so they have developed, I'm going to quickly go to it, what we call as they call the matrix of oppression. So you may have been exposed to this. This is what is being taught in many of the universities, especially in America. There are many books. So this is a Routledge book, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. And this is the division, that binary of society into these two binaries, this matrix of oppression. So we see the oppressors, or the privileged group on the left, and is divided into these social identity categories. Your race, your sex, your gender, your sexual orientation, your class, your ability or disability, your religion, your age. So the oppressor group, I think you can clearly identify where you sit, is white, biological male, gender conforming, biological men and women, heterosexual, rich upper class, able-bodied Protestants, and adults. Your oppressed group, Asian, Black, Latino, Native people, biological women, transgender, lesbians, gays, working class, poor people, people with disabilities, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, elders, and young people. Okay, so we are now divided into these identity groups, and our value is determined by the groups in which we find ourselves. So I want to go back. We can have a look at that later again if you would like to see that. Okay, so now this critical theory, the social justice, this matrix of oppression feeds into these other types of theories or ideologies. And here we find the gender theory, which obviously has a particular influence on family, and we have queer theory. Queer theory has become really interesting for me because I didn't fully understand it. And when I understand queer theory, what it means is it's a rejection of norms. So it's a rejection and a liberation from the normal. So it uses normativity, that word normativity, pejoratively. So you would have heard the term heteronormativity. It's not positive. So it's saying if you were a male and you like women, that's heteronormativity. They want to break that apart. So they reject all forms of categories: male, female, heterosexual, homosexual. Everything is fluid. And so it's just a rejection of everything that is normal, or where the norms sit. Then with the gender theory, is obviously also a branch of the social justice paradigm. We see this very much so, like the comprehensive sexuality education coming into the schools, being taught. Again, remember that reification, as if it is, as if these things are truth, and not that we question them, or not that we can't disagree with them. So the roots are feminism, but this feminism has moved into gender, and we're seeing the effects of this. Female sports there is pushback, but I think feminists are finding themselves with a real dilemma, where all of a sudden the men are beating them in all the sports. They just identify as a woman. So we might be seeing the end of female sports. I think there will be pushback though. So with the key in this manifestation is the idea of intersectionality. So in this new gender theory, so these intersections of oppression, making gender, so feminine, or characteristics or traits of being feminine, or characteristics or traits of being masculine, and not biological sex, whereas your early feminists were looking about equality on the basis of biological sex. So we should be equal, irrespective of our biological sex, male, female. Now it's gender. It's that I feel feminine or I feel masculine. So that's kind of like now the central understanding. So I put here Dr. John Money, for those of you who want to go and look at this very, very controversial figure who has become very influential, especially in our schools, and in terms of the gender theology. So Dr. John Money was a psychologist and a sexologist, and he was one of the first to develop the idea that gender, that feminine feeling or that masculine feeling or that trait, is socially constructed, just socially constructed. So he established the first clinic which performed sexual reassignment, He's a highly controversial figure, especially in terms of the so-called studies that he did. He conducted involuntary sex reassignment on the child Dave Raymer. You might know the story. So this family, they had 2 boys, twin boys, and there was I want to say it's not, there was a botched surgery done on David Raymer, where they what is it? I want to say it's castration, but it's not. But you know what I mean. It's so anyway. So they burnt his penis as a little baby. And so what this psychologist, Dr. John Money, did is that he said, well, this is a wonderful opportunity to show that gender is just socially constructed, and he reconstructed this little boy to look like a girl, without obviously him knowing it. And he grew up really conflicted, not knowing why he always wanted to be the one to climb the trees, why he always wanted to be, he's supposed to be a girl, but he didn't feel very pretty. He felt like he wanted to be roughing and toughing with the boys. And later his parents admitted that he was actually a biological boy. He eventually committed suicide at the age of 38, and his brother died of an overdose at the age of 36. This is the type of research on which we are building the gender theology and the transgender ideology. Okay. So we can go back to that. So this is just in a more comprehensive form. So just in case you are wondering again where you find yourself as the oppressor or the oppressed, I just want to, moving forward in my notes while you look at that. So I want to encourage you to be careful of supposedly ubiquitous terms, especially you're in the media, and sometimes we, as I said, especially around social justice and critical theories, it's often the air that we breathe, that we find ourselves in these waters, and we use these terms because everybody is using these terms. So some of the terms are diversity, equity, and inclusion. And always ask what it is that is meant by it as something like social justice. Terms like these diversity, equity, and inclusion are actually Orwellian doublespeak. And diversity is actually, according to the social justice movement, is about uniformity of thought. It's really about agreements around critical theory and social justice, but with different persons from different groups affirming that uniformity of thought. So you'll see something like someone like a Candace Owen, who's a Republican, is it Kanye West? So and Thomas Sowell, who are conservative African Americans and Black voices are speaking, and they get told, well, you're actually not politically Black anymore. You're because you don't speak the right language, you don't say the right things. So it's that you have to agree with these terms, and then everybody inside there are the different categories. Equity is not about inherent human value, and the term what we would use is equality, but it's about equality of outcome. And this is a typical communist expectation, and that's the utopian idea of a classless society. So it's equality of outcome despite merit or human effort. It's inequitable outcomes. Other words, inequitable outcomes can only be attributed to racism, sexism, or social oppression. Yes, sometimes that is true, but for them, it is only that. That's the only truth. So we are called to attribute all our outcomes, all our successes, and all our failures to an external force, to a systemic force. So that's that Trojan horse. So I call it a Trojan horse because it sounds so nice, but I don't think it is what we think it is. And then what often happens, and we see this, is that because there's that assumption of sexism, for example, when there is an incident, then it's a systemic sexism, and therefore into business we should bring a diversity consultant. So some of these diversity consultants, one of the key ones is Robin DiAngelo in America, and she charges, I had a look, $12,000 US per hour for her lectures. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, this diversity training. I think it's like 230,000 Rand an hour for her training. Okay, so why is this inconsistent with Christianity? So critical theory offers a different view of humanity. Critical theory says that our identity and our value is measured in terms of social categories, our race, our gender, and our social status. The Bible says we are all created in the image of God. We are image bearers. We are all inherently valuable. Our identity is rooted in our Creator, not in our social characteristics. As a creator, he determines our identity. We do not get to determine our identity. Critical theory offers a different view of sin. It says, for us, sin is missing the mark, and that we have all sinned. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's none that good. No, there's none that is good. No, not one. We all cannot enter the presence of God because none of us is holy. It's only through Jesus. Whereas for critical theory, they only see sin as oppression. Yes, oppression is a sin, but it is not the only sin. And therefore that there's some who are sinners, the oppressor, and those who are sinned against the oppressed. And therefore the oppressor is bad, evil, and the oppressed is good. Because critical theory gets the problem wrong, it also gets the solution wrong. In Christianity, we are all equally sinful, and salvation can only come through Jesus and repentance of sin. But critical theory says that it's only the oppressors that are guilty, while the oppressed are not. And in this, it keeps both from salvation, because there's also never any real forgiveness. You continue, you repent, but there's no forgiveness and there's no salvation. And people also don't understand that they are sinful. They will not access that forgiveness. Okay, so the social justice is perhaps a more touchy one. So Isaiah 30 says, yes, the Lord is a God of justice. Unfortunately, what we've done is we've inserted the word, the Lord is a God of social justice, but that is not what the word says. So justice is getting what you deserve without favor. So here I've got the illustration of Lady Justice, and she's got the band around her eyes. And the point of this is that justice is blinded. So if you should receive justice irrespective of your social status, irrespective of your race or your gender or your sex. But social justice is getting what you do not deserve because you are favored. So it's that encouragement, especially of institutions, to act partially as opposed to impartially. So you see here that Lady Justice doesn't have the band around her eyes. So you are favored in terms of those categories, in terms of your race, in terms of your gender and so forth. So what is lost in social justice is individual responsibility, because it always says everything is external, it's always systemic. It's always the external, it's always acted upon. And therefore I don't have to take responsibility for my actions or for my circumstances. So Leviticus 19 verses 15 says it very clearly: do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Thomas Sowell, we seem to be getting closer and closer to a situation where nobody is responsible for what they did, but we are all responsible for what somebody else did. So gender theory argues that it's not just economics that creates oppression, but the nuclear family, traditional morality, and concepts of race. So I want to quickly show you this, where this is a feminist speaking about the abolition of the family. Will you let me know if it doesn't work?
Relationships of care, not the kind of destruction of the relationships we already have. Capitalism and capitalist states rely really heavily on the family as a unit of social discipline, social order, austerity, and a source of huge amounts of unpaid labor. In the history of feminism, abolishing the family was, very well known as a
Sorry, we've lost audio on the video.
Autonomy over the households.
Can you see the video?
Yes, we've got it back.
Feminists who have mounted an analysis of the private nuclear household as the site of the overwhelming majority of the rape and abuse that takes place on Earth. Family abolition means that we deserve more. We deserve more than the sort of blackmail that tells us that we must be content with relationships defined as blood or as nature, the relationships we find given to us. It means that we could develop forms of comradeliness, forms of chosen, or in the phrase of the xenofeminists, sort of xenofam. Xenofam can be as good as, at least as good as, relationships of sort of biological or biogenetic nature. So that's one way of thinking about abolition as a process of building and growing all the kind of forms of love and care and solidarity that we deserve.
Did it work? I think it was me muting it. Okay. So you can see this, could you see the Marxist terms coming through, the dialectic, and the problem with the family is that it creates stability and austerity. And I'm just thinking, yes, that sounds great. But we can see the gender ideology, radical gender ideology coming through, and this consistent call for the abolition of the family. And we see the infiltration of the radical gender ideology into our schools. We're seeing this now, right now. And this is a draft guidelines on gender identity and sexual orientation in public schools of the Western Cape Education Department. They're trying to sign this in this year. And what is the purpose? Promote gender identity and gender expression. Where does this come from? When does gender identity and gender expression come from? The ideas come from Dr. John Money. These are his ideas. This is where this comes from. Gender expression is that an LGBTQI plus learner has a right to choose a first name or their sex, irrespective of their sex assigned at birth. Now, can you see we're moving away from biology? So it's that sex assigned at birth. It's not, we can clearly see, when the baby's lifted up, this is a boy or this is a girl. No, I assign this. This is where we're going, and this is that whole thing of everything is a social construction. So even your sex, even your biological sex, where you have an XX chromosome, an XY chromosome, or it's now assigned at birth. It's a social construct. It's not real. And you can see the move of the postmodernism and the influence of postmodernism happening right here. And then integrating gender topics into the curriculum. So you see this infiltration of the public into the private, coming in and starting to teach an ideology or an attempt to teach ideology, using the schools to teach an ideology, an ideological, radical gender ideology into the schools. So I see my time is up. Can I have 5 more minutes? Okay. So I don't know if you've seen the genderbread person. So it looks very nice, and it's obviously supposed to look very nice and very appealing to children. So this is the idea, and apparently I'm going to show you the genderbread unicorn, or not the genderbread, the gender unicorn. And then they give this even to preschoolers. This is happening in American schools where they get to color this in, and already you're starting to teach kids that, well, you don't yet know if you were a boy or a girl, and it's okay, and it's very pretty and it's cute. So here, what is interesting is that there's still a recognition of biological sex. So male and female, and this, it says the biological sex refers to objectively measurable organs, hormones, chromosomes, and it clearly it's distinction between male and female. But then you obviously got your sexual orientation, your gender expression, your gender identity again, which came from Dr. John Money. But some of the concerns of the genderbread person was at first it looked like a male. And you can't have the patriarchy. So they wanted to remove it looking like a genderbread man. Also the problem with sex, biological sex. So now it's the gender unicorn. And there we see sex assigned at birth. So that even now biological sex and your chromosomes and all of that are now up for reassignments and to be, they're just social constructs. And you see it's very cute. At least it's a little more honest and being mythical in the line of postmodernism, because it's not real. And so you can imagine that this is very appealing to young kids. They get to play. It looks very innocuous, very sweet and very cute, but obviously bringing lots of confusion to young people. Okay. So we see the comprehensive sexuality education curriculum. I do want to say that please, those of you who are parents, please be well aware that this is not a compulsory program, and that was fought against by civil society to say that that they could recommend it as guidelines. So they often bring this in with the life orientation programs. But no school is compelled to use it. And so you can actually feed back to your school and say, look, can I see the life orientation program? And my kids can't. And I do that with every school I go to. I say, please note that my kids cannot participate if there's comprehensive sexuality education. And the schools are generally actually quite receptive. We see that inside the comprehensive sexuality education, it undermines the role, the value, and the authority of parents. In the Educator's Guide for Grade 5s, and this is obviously to the educators, the teachers, it warns them that parents may have their own views or prejudices about their children being exposed to some of the content of the scripted lessons plan. So they're pitting the state curriculum against the values of parents. And then we see the sexualizing and the grooming of the children. Grade 4s, 9-year-olds are shown graphic pictures of private body parts. Grade 5s are presented with a sexual assault scenario. In grade 7s, they're told about masturbation and it won't hurt you. So the slow progression of the sexualizing of the kids and the kind of normalizing and getting them to be sexually curious at very, very early and inappropriate ages. So, to give us time for questions, I'm not going to show this, but this is you can even look it up perhaps afterwards. Carol Everett. So if you want to have a look and watch it later, she was heading an abortion clinic, and it's an incredible story where she actually confesses to actually using things like the comprehensive sexual education to sexualize children from an early age, because early abortion begets more abortion. So you want to get young people sexually active at as early a stage as possible, because if they then have an abortion, they are likely to have more abortions. So this is all about the profit motive and having more abortions as quickly as possible, getting them sexualized as early as possible. So I do encourage you, it's not easy, and she does it with, you can see the heaviness and the weight of the understanding of what she's been doing. So that's Carol Everett. You can have a look later. Oops, sorry. So are we here? And this is obviously the political scientist coming through. Hannah Arendt studied the origins of totalitarianism. She was a German Jew, and she studied the totalitarians, the communist totalitarian and the Nazi totalitarian systems. And she defined a totalitarian society as one in which an ideology seeks to displace all prior traditions and institutions with the goal of bringing all aspects of society under the control of that ideology. And I would argue that this is where we are moving towards. So let's get practical. And then I'm hoping I have spoken a little to Rudolf Kabutz. Thank you for your questions. I'm hoping I have spoken to some of the questions that you raised, but maybe hear a little bit more around the practical. I know I'm speaking to those of you who are in Christian media. I do think the first thing is always to be grounded. Let's always get our priorities right. It's God, it's family, it's friends. We need to be enjoying and living life. Do not be ignorant. Equip and educate yourselves. Again, I take us back to the Colossians 2. Be firm in Christ and do not be deceived. So unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of being ignorant. And we have to understand these things so that we know that we are not actually participating in them. Equip and educate others. I think that you're in social media, and in media, which gives you an enormous platform to help and educate Christians. And then this is the injunction from Solzhenitsyn, who survived the gulags in Soviet Russia, and then wrote the book which exposed what was happening in Soviet Russia with the Gulag archipelagos. And when he left Soviet Russia, his injunction to his fellow Russians was, don't live by lies. And I think this is an injunction for us today, is that wherever you find yourself, do not live by lies. That don't speak a lie, don't promote a lie, don't put the lie in media. We need to speak truth, and it's going to be more and more difficult. Discern when you're engaging with a woke militant. Unfortunately, as I said, with the woke movement, they don't engage. Their idea and their modus operandi is fear, manipulation, aggression, intimidation, and character assassination. So you must be very discerning and vigilant when you're engaging with them. And sometimes you just have to step back because there isn't a place to engage. Sometimes I know it'll be in your face because you're in media. And then maybe what you're doing is you're speaking less to the person, the woke person, and you're speaking to the people around you, and think about the audience rather than who you're engaging with. And then for parents, and then be brave. We're going to have to be very brave. Take up your God-given authority and responsibility, be vigilant, read the life orientation projects, the books, the scripts of plays that they want to put your kids in, ask to see the costumes that they want to put them in, and then be involved in your schools. So here are a couple of resources to equip yourselves. I trust that many of you know these. The Truth of It, PragerU, New Discourses, and some books, Live Not by Lies. We can come back to this. I just want to say, therefore, and I want to leave you with this and encourage you. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Just go back to the resources. I'm done, Dave.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicola. This is, it's challenging, I think is the word. And really the challenge is to our response as Christian broadcasters. You know, how do we help? Christian broadcasting on the whole is speaking to Christians, but a lot of Christians are not are going into this blindfolded because we're not aware of what is happening in the background. Every now and then some things kind of come through and then we push them out again. But it's our kids and our grandchildren and how we help them. Any questions? I think that this list of resources, Natalie, you can make that available to attendees afterwards. So perhaps if we go back to full screen, or what is the people view or whatever, then if anyone has a question, just unmute and put it there, or you can put your hand up on the reactions, and we can you can ask your question.
Maybe I can kick it off. Nicola, thank you so much again for that. It's just very, very eye-opening and very important where we're living. Just the thing that I'm wondering about, you speak about how this postmodernism, this critical theory, where we're living, is this this kind of attack on our values and saying this is what it is, and if you don't agree with us, you're excluded, and there's a lack of rationalizing. Have you found any potential arguments to kind of put that in front of them, to say, but you know, to try and say, hey, but can we get rational about this? Can we engage in a conversation? Can I share my perspective? Are there ways that you found maybe more helpful in presenting that and not just getting completely shut down from the start?
I just wanted, Thanks, Graham. The word that you used there, which is for me very interesting, is you said we're being excluded, and yes, that is exactly what's happening. And I want to go back to those words: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's why I say there's double speak happening. You are excluded. You're not allowed to speak. Your voice is not allowed. And unfortunately, it goes back to also what David says when he spoke about it being a theology, but it's a theology which is totalitarian and it's totalizing. So what you're asking for is what we had when we engaged with, say, secular humanists, where there was like, okay, I'm going to let you speak because that's how we debate and we engage and we learn. And that's also the whole scientific method, isn't it? Is that you realize we don't know everything fully. And so we kind of, okay, I hadn't thought about that. And you're right. Let me think about that one. But have you thought about this? And you can come away from conversations which are like really heated, and I love them. They are like some of my best conversations where you go in with goodwill and disagreements, and you come out and you're like, oh, that was great, that was meaty. But you come out saying, okay, I don't agree with you in everything, but let's go have a coffee or let's go have a glass of wine. And I think that was the environment which we were in, and it was fun. You know, it was also fun. So I think what you're asking for is wishful thinking. I don't think that's where we are now, and because it's a moral crusade for them. So they see it as again, it's this march towards this utopia, and we are standing in the way of this utopia. This beautiful world that once we had this revolution, it's all going to be, I don't know what it's going to be, but in their idea, it's this utopian thinking, and we are standing in the way of this utopia. So it's a moral imperative for them to shut down, to cancel. That's why you're seeing also in the academic world this cancel culture. We don't let you speak because you are hurtful and you are hateful and you're bigoted and you're all of that. So we can't let you speak. So it's a moral imperative, a moral campaign on their side. I do want to say that I do really think this is a minority. So I think we should not be so intimidated by it. That's why we should speak to those who are, like, if you're speaking in an environment where someone is attacking you, rather think about the audience around you and speak to the audience. So one of the ways is to say, well, like, thanks for the question. You've illustrated this very nicely of the modus operandi of how the work culture works, and that's delegitimizing and ad hominem attacks. So kind of illustrative, you speak to the audience than necessarily to that person. Obviously, we still got to love them in the midst of all of it, but I just think we can't expect that we're going to be engaging in the same way that we perhaps engaged in the secular humanist environment. And just also to, I think, equip people, and it's a very intimidating environment. So I have been in an environment where, oh my goodness, there was nothing that I could possibly do. Then I tried to keep quiet, and then I was singled out, and then when I tried to explain myself, then I was told that I was smirking, and it just comes for you. It's aggressive, and you're like, oh my goodness, there's actually nothing you can really say. So one, try and not get yourself into that environment. Two, try not be intimidated by it, and three, remember the audience around which you're speaking to. And I think we're going to have to be brave. We're going to have to be brave like never before, and speak truth, because people need to still hear the truth.
Yeah, I think a lot of the trouble is that we're put in boxes.
Yeah.
And whatever we say is irrelevant because of the box that we're in.
Yeah.
So one of my challenges here is to develop. The Bible is full of stories, but just to try and develop drama and story and conversation that breaks the walls of those boxes a bit, but that's not easy.
Yeah. I do think it's, sorry, Dave. Yeah.
Okay.
I think the other thing is that it shouts very loud, you know, this environment. So I do think it's a small group of these activists, and that is also what it is. It's an activism, and the activists shout very loud. So it's intimidating rather than having much substance. And so when we engage with it, we're engaging with the substance, and hopefully you, as I said, speaking to the people around, where people have like a sense that this doesn't make sense to me, you are equipping them and helping them. But it's loud and intimidating and not necessarily with substance.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for your presentation this morning. Many of the radio stations and media organizations, they've got people that actually develop the content, that have news bulletins, they engage with the audience, they try and look for local topics where people are interested in, and they engage with these topics. I would assume that many of these people are not here at the webinar today. Those who actually do the live programming, those who produce the media content. What sort of guidelines can you help us with that such media producers can, on the one side, understand these worldviews that you're presenting, so that they understand what is happening in society, while at the same time finding ways to also set up a framework of a biblical worldview that can contrast what they are seeing? How can these media people really be almost equipped and resourced so that as they engage with the audience and as they produce content, that they've got guidelines both for the current worldviews in society as well as the biblical worldview that often contrast for how we are being pushed against with the worldviews around us?
Rudolph, I almost actually just want to send that back to you. Because you know, that you're in the media world. So what can you do? So I mean, something like this is, why not use a presentation and ask everybody to listen to it? You know, here is a tool of equipping. And I provided the resources and tell the people, okay, so these are some of the resources that you need to read. And I just want to say that Cynical Theories is a secular humanist. He's a mathematician. So he's not actually a Christian, but he's probably one of the best, I would say it's one of the best expositions of what's going on. So I think it's, you know, so I'd like to hear what you think. Or maybe what somebody else in the media world thinks. What can you do? There are resources, as I said. There's, you know, the PragerU. There's a Truth of It. There's this Discourses. That website again. It's by James Lindsay, and he really kind of opens up these terms. So it's not necessarily Christian, but it does help to understand. Yeah, so maybe those of you who are in media, maybe you can answer Rudolph's question.
Yeah, I think it's important, Natalie, that we distribute through through ACM those resources, and just encourage content producers to be aware. It's always a tricky thing, this, as to, you know, how much you're looking. You need to focus on the Lord, but you need to be aware of the enemy, and to get that balance, because you don't want to give these critical theorists a platform, but we need to understand exactly how they are thinking of us, so that we can reach out and love, because they're people. And somehow that we need to look at the cracks in those boxes and find the way through. GNCR, question there?
Just a comment about creating content, you know, to help people in this situation. One of our content producers, Larisse Farie, she attended your talk, Nicola, at the Africa Enterprise.
Okay.
And she says, and she is particularly interested in helping young people. And from her network of people that she interviews, she finds the best way is to get testimonies of people that have come out of these things, that have seen the wolf for their own eyes, you know, because somewhere deep down, if we're all created in the image of God, there will be those hidden questions, those nightmarish moments when these people might catch a wake-up call. But if they hear a testimony of someone who actually went so far as maybe having a sex change and then came out of that or was in the woke culture and tried to disband in their family or something. Testimonies are always what Jesus says, we're overcome by, well, you know that scripture, blood of the Lamb, word of our testimony, and that we did not love our lives unto death. So it seems the war is on. But I'm only relieved that you said it's a minority of people.
Yeah. If I could say also, it's very much so coming out of the academia. So the thing is, as I said, initially everyone was kind of expecting they would stay inside like the liberal arts, you know, where we get to think about these things and kind of, you know, play around with ideas and absurd ideas and crazy things. But unfortunately, it's kind of moved into the social activism and then into the world. So, I mean, how many companies now, they have diversity consultants and then they do diversity training. And so it's become very much, and now into schools, and we see with the curriculum of comprehensive sexuality education, is that what was actually just academic kind of ramblings and thoughts has now actually become, it presented itself as real, and that's the concern. As I also want to quickly say, there was, just Dave, what you were saying, and that's why I started with the Colossians, is that we have two requirements. One is to be firmly established in the word, and to know the word. So, and I think this is obviously, for speaking to Rudolph's question as well, is one trusts that people are deeply eating of the word, every day, and that's where we find our strength, and those are the worldview which we interpret everything, and that's where we also don't be discouraged, so we always have hope in this environment. We have to live with hope, and that's why I say we have to prioritize faith, family, and friends, because if we look like, oh my goodness, like now who's going to want to actually even kind of be in our world if we're so dreary and downcast? We're not supposed to be like that. We're supposed to be light. That's the one side, but the other side is not to be deceived. And the thing is, the concern I have is that we often use the world's words. And we're swimming in their waters, and we are condoning and espousing the world's ways, as opposed to actually looking at it and going, well, actually, is that really in line with the word? So that's it. There's two sides to it. Is don't be deceived, and we shouldn't be promoting things which are unbiblical.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nicola. I think that is a great way to end this morning, because it sums it up, and it gives us the direction in which we need to be training our content producers and educating and encouraging and setting the example, so that Christian media may speak the words of life and love, and not also be putting people in boxes that can't be reached.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nicola. It's really been great to be able to learn some of these things. It's quite disturbing, but it's also good when you really can see the origins and the results of these theories.
Yeah.
Thank you. Natalie, can I just hand over to you to close up? Thanks so much, Nicola. Bless you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Nicola. Next week, we will have Herman du Plessis speaking on fully engaged, how to use your time effectively. Some of you here will be attending, but I just want to encourage you, if you haven't registered to attend it, to consider coming along. He's going to be speaking on the importance of leadership, time management, healthy boundaries, energy management, and building resilience as well. So really consider coming and joining us online for that one. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.